Our next speaker is, where's Corinne? Here you are. Corinne Schlierenzauer, and Corinne's a PhD candidate at the Queensland University of Technology, studying the pattern and distribution of native and non-native plants in grassy woodlands. She's interested in ecosystem management, plant-animal interactions, and conservation biology. It's a good combination. Her title of her talk is Scattered Trees Influence and Understory Flora in Grassy Eucalypt Woodlands, depending on tree size and species. Thanks, Corinne.
So I'm a PhD candidate, and today I'm presenting one of my PhD studies, which has the title Beneath Tree Canopies, Tree Size and Species Matter on How Scattered Trees Influence Understory Flora in Grassy Eucalypt Woodlands. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the places where I have conducted my PhD. So I'm based in Brisbane on Turrbal and Jaguar country, and my fieldwork was at the far south coast in New South Wales, in Yuin country. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So, as we know, eucalypt woodlands are fairly common in Australia, but they have also drastically declined, as we can see here based on the pink areas. Particularly in the southern regions, in temperate areas, these woodlands have strongly declined. And in my PhD, I've been focusing on a community called the lowland grassy woodlands of the southeast corner bioregion, which is in the temperate area as well. So these woodlands are normally dominated by Angophora floribunda trees and Eucalyptus teraticornis, and they have a large diversity of herbaceous species in the understory. As said, they have also drastically declined, and nowadays only 20% of their original extent is remaining, and they are listed as critically endangered under the EPBC Act. Reasons for their decline are mainly associated to agricultural expansion, and this often results in a strong decline of the tree layer, with often only scattered trees within grazed paddocks that are remaining. And this is also where my PhD research came into place. I was interested in how these scattered trees affect the understory. So trees can affect the understory, or specifically the spatial distribution, the productivity, and the species composition in the understory based on their traits. So that includes, for example, based on their resource requirements, but also based on their size, based on their density, root system, etc. And the understory can respond based on their resource requirements or their photosynthetic pathway. And generally, tree understory interactions are also strongly dependent on ecosystem parameters such as resource requirement, resource availability, disturbances such as fire, and herbivore intensity. There are a few studies that have already looked at scattered trees, and some common findings include, for example, that the soil bulk density beneath scattered trees is often lower compared to adjacent open areas, whereas soil nutrient levels are generally higher, and obviously we have a reduction in light conditions, which can also have associated microclimatic effects. But as I've mentioned before, the way trees affect the understory can depend on their traits, and but generally, studies that looked at scattered trees rarely considered different traits or different tree species. And this can have implication for the understory. For example, a nitrogen-fixing tree is often associated also with higher soil nitrogen level beneath their canopies compared to adjacent open areas. And as said, very few studies considered these traits or different species, but one exception is, for example, in Hawaii, where they looked at cleared forest areas and found, for example, a higher native understory diversity beneath specific species of scattered trees, and a reduced abundance of non-native pasture species beneath trees. And these nuanced differences could also have implications for an ecosystem such as the lowland grassy woodlands, because we have a high number of non-native plant species there, and also some invasive plant species. One of the most common and problematic invasive species in that area is African lovegrass, or Erogostis curvula. This species has been originally introduced as a pasture species, but then it turned out to be low in palatability, so it is problematic from an agricultural point of view, but also in an ecological context, because it is able to produce these dense swards and can also produce monocultures, and sites that are invaded by this species have also been found to be lower in species richness. And yeah, a study that's been recently conducted in the lowland grassy woodlands found that pastures where trees are present have usually a lower abundance of African lovegrass. And in addition to that, landholders of the areas have also observed that particularly beneath Angophora floribunda trees, African lovegrass is reduced in abundance. And so I was interested in testing this hypothesis. So the overall goal of my study was how understory plant species composition and microsite conditions differ beneath scattered trees of different species and different size classes. So based on the hypothesis I mentioned before, I was particularly interested in Angophora floribunda, but then I also wanted to compare it to other tree species, and so I looked at Eucalyptus teraticornis because that's one of the most common trees in these woodlands. And then I was also interested to look at different sizes of trees because potentially some effects might only be present at trees of a certain size. And so the way I investigated this research question was I surveyed the understory beneath 38 scattered trees. These trees were randomly selected across 4 farms, and at each tree I set up 9 different plots. So 3 of these plots were beneath the canopies of trees, and 3 of them at the edges, and then 3 plots in adjacent open areas. I also looked at some environmental parameters around these trees. So for example, soil bulk density, soil nutrient levels, and grazing intensity. I also measured some tree trait variables, and I ended up then using the tree volume as a proxy for tree size. And so what I found in terms of differences between the 2 tree species was that Eucalyptus teraticornis had a higher canopy base height, whereas Angophora floribunda trees had a higher leaf area index. And these differences can result in different light conditions beneath these canopies, with Angophora floribunda trees having lower light levels beneath its canopy. But then I found also a few variables that did not differ between these 2 tree species. So tree size was similar, grazing intensity was similar around these trees, and also the soil parameters were similar. But I did find higher soil nutrient levels beneath the canopies of trees compared to adjacent open area, which is in line with numerous other studies. And this effect was particularly stronger at larger trees, where the soil nutrient levels were even higher beneath the canopies and adjacent open areas at larger trees. And then I was also interested in this plant species composition. So I conducted non-metric multidimensional scaling. And so each dot here represents the plant species composition of a plot that I surveyed. And the different colors represent the different tree species. And we cannot really see any distinctive grouping or clustering, but we can see that the centroids, which are, for example, for Angophora floribunda, the dark blue squares. So, for example, here was shifted away from the centroid of the open plots, which are the crosses, whereas for Eucalyptus teraticornis, the centroid overlaps with the open plot. But somehow it's also unsurprising that there were not really any strong differences, because I looked at a large range of tree sizes. So trees ranged from DBH 13 up to 2 meters, and there were fewer effects beneath smaller trees compared to larger trees. I also looked at certain tree trait variables and how they related to the dissimilarity between canopy and adjacent open plots, and found, for example, a negative correlation between canopy base height and dissimilarity. And I found that a higher leaf area index was associated also with a higher dissimilarity between canopy and adjacent open plots. I was also interested in in plant species richness in the understory. So I looked at native and non-native plants separately, and I did not find a difference for native species richness depending on the tree species or plot position, but I found a negative correlation with tree size and native plant species richness. So at larger trees, there were fewer native species beneath the canopies and open areas, like independently of plot position. Whereas for non-native species, I found a reduced number of non-native species beneath the canopies and edges compared to the open areas. But I have to mention that it is a relatively weak reduction when we look at the mean. But again, that's across all tree sizes and tree species. I was then also interested in differences in African lovegrass cover, and I also looked at kangaroo grass, which is one of the most common native species in these areas. And so I specifically compared or took the difference from the canopy to the adjacent open plot, or from the edge and the adjacent open plot. And I found that African lovegrass was reduced in cover beneath Angoffer trees, but not beneath Eucalyptus terricornis. And I found a similar effect for kangaroo grass. And so because both of these grass species are relatively dominant, now you probably wonder if they're both reduced beneath Angoffer trees, which other species are there? And so the most common species that were higher in abundance beneath Angoffer trees was mainly Mycolina stipoides, which is a native species, and to a lesser extent Poa, which is also a native species, and both of them are sea-free species. But then there was also Cenchrus clandestinus, or also known as Kikuyu, which was more abundant beneath particularly larger trees, and that one is a C4 species, so indicating that it was not solely the photosynthetic pathway that resulted in these differences. So what does it all mean? I found a lower native species richness beneath larger trees, and this could potentially be associated to also the higher soil nutrient levels that I found beneath these trees. It could have also been more of an indirect effect that these higher soil nutrient levels may have benefited Kikuyu, which is also a relatively competitive species, and therefore it might have been harder for native species to coexist under these conditions. Generally, I found most differences in plant species composition were associated to differences in the abundance of the dominant species. And one potential reason could be associated to grazing, because a study that's been conducted by Doro and colleagues found that grazing can reduce the spatial heterogeneity in the understory. And they also found that trees had weaker effects in areas that had higher grazing intensity compared to lower grazing intensity areas. Generally, I also found stronger effects of plant species composition beneath larger trees compared to smaller trees. And this indicates that especially these large trees, they contribute to a large variety of microsite conditions. And also, in line with many other studies, large trees are highly important for biodiversity on farms, or not only for flora, but also for fauna. But the smaller trees are highly important too, because many of the large trees are in decline across agricultural areas. And I also looked at the recruitment, and I found some recruitment of both tree species, but there was only recruitment present in 7% of all the plots that I surveyed. And yeah, as I've mentioned, tree species can be highly relevant. So there was this lower abundance of kangaroo grass beneath Angoffer trees, but not beneath eucalypts. A study that's been conducted by Prober and colleagues also found a reduced abundance of kangaroo grass beneath tree canopies, but they did not distinguish between different tree species, and they mainly associated their findings to higher nutrient levels beneath trees. But here I did not really find any difference in nutrient levels between the two tree species, so it is more likely to be, or microclimatic effects are likely to be contributing to that effect. And then I found a reduced cover of the invasive African lovegrass. And based on this, the next question that is coming up would tree planting or planting and gopher trees in areas that are invaded by African lovegrass result in a similar effect? And if that would be the case, and if tree planting would be a management option, then as a follow-up question would be, how many trees can we plant to still maintain the characteristics of the lowland grassy woodlands, which are characterized by an open tree canopy layer? So yeah, I would like to thank you for listening, and also thanks everyone who was involved in the project.
Thanks, Corinne.